Welcome back to the deep dive. This week, we're diving into the 2024 presidential election, and things are really heating up with just 1 week left. We've got a whole bunch of news articles fresh off the press, capturing all the latest happenings on the campaign trail. Both candidates are making their final push. So are you ready to unpack this?
Absolutely. It's coming right down to the wire now. Over 49 million Americans have already voted early, and that's just an unbelievable number.
That's right. The stakes couldn't be higher, and both candidates are pulling out all the stops. Tuesday evening, VP Kamala Harris chose a very interesting location for her closing argument, the Ellipse. Now, why would that be significant? Well, this is the same spot where former President Trump spoke to his supporters just before the January 6th Capitol attack.
What's so interesting here is the symbolism. Like, she's reclaiming that space. It's almost like she wants to rewrite the narrative. She wants to project this message of unity and strength in a place that has become a symbol of division.
That's a really good point. And it's an even more powerful image when you consider the size of the crowd organizers expected. Over 50,000 people. Talk about making a statement.
Yeah.
And she really hammered this point home in her speech.
Exactly. One line that really stood out to me was when she said, "The United States of America is the greatest idea humanity ever devised." It's a clear appeal to patriotism and optimism, probably aimed at undecided voters looking for, a positive vision for the future.
It's definitely a huge contrast to the events of January 6th, for sure. But what about the other side of the race? Former President Trump focused his attention on Pennsylvania and held a rally in Allentown.
Pennsylvania is really make or break for Trump. It's the most important of all the battleground states. And Allentown, with its large Latino population, makes it a very strategic location for him to try and win over this key demographic.
So he's playing the demographics game. Smart move considering how close the race is. A recent CBS News poll shows them neck and neck in Pennsylvania, so every single vote really does count. But it wasn't just rallies this week. There was a very interesting development involving Joe Rogan.
Yeah, the famous podcaster actually tried to interview VP Harris. We don't know what they plan to talk about, but it definitely highlights the increasing influence of these non-traditional media platforms in shaping the narrative around the election.
It really makes you wonder how that interview might have played out, especially with Rogan's incredibly diverse audience. It could have reached voters outside the usual political circles, but not everything went smoothly on the campaign trail this week. There was actually some controversy around Trump's event at Madison Square Garden.
Oh, yeah. Some of the remarks he made during his final message speech were met with some pretty harsh criticism. Some people accused him of being divisive and potentially dangerous. Trump defended himself, though, claiming his words were taken out of context.
So we've got two very different strategies in play here. Harris is emphasizing unity and optimism while Trump is appealing directly to his base. But both candidates seem to be going all in on targeted messaging in these last few days.
It's fascinating to see how these strategies are unfolding. We see this deliberate focus on specific demographics and locations, a clear acknowledgement that every single vote matters in this really tight race.
Speaking of locations, Harris picked a pretty interesting spot to spend election night. She's going to be at Howard University, which is her alma mater. What do you think about that?
That's an interesting choice. By choosing a historically Black university, she could be sending a message about her commitment to education, diversity, and inclusivity. It adds another layer to her campaign narrative and could resonate with young voters and minority groups.
It really does feel like we're watching history unfold right before our eyes. So much is at stake, and these closing arguments give us a glimpse into how each candidate is planning to secure those crucial final votes. So what else stood out to you about the events this week?
It's the contrast in messaging and tone that's really striking. Harris is trying to project a message of unity and a vision for the future, but Trump is sticking to rallying his base and emphasizing his accomplishments. It really reflects their broader campaign strategies and how they each think they can win this election. It's interesting to think about the demographics of Allentown a little more. It's not just about the Latino population. Allentown has a large working-class population, and a lot of them have been struggling because of the way the economy has changed in recent years.
So Trump going there is very strategic. He's trying to connect with voters who are feeling left behind, people who might see him as someone who understands their economic concerns.
Exactly. And when you look back at his speeches, he always talks about things like economic revival, bringing back manufacturing jobs, and protecting American workers. It's a message that really connects with a specific group of voters, particularly in places that have seen a decline in industry.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's a good reminder that elections are often decided based on how people feel about the economy. And it's not just Trump who's focusing on these anxieties about the economy. Harris also talked about economic concerns in her speech at the Ellipse.
Oh, for sure. She mentioned lowering costs for families, making the middle class stronger, and ensuring that corporations and wealthy people are paying their fair share. It's a message that aims to address the financial struggles many Americans are facing.
It seems like both candidates are really trying to understand what's important to the nation. They recognize that a lot of voters care most about economic security.
Exactly. It's all about connecting with voters on a personal level, understanding their worries, and offering solutions that actually make sense in their everyday lives. But let's go back to the controversy around Trump's event at Madison Square Garden. I think there's a lot to unpack there.
You're right, we can't just ignore that. What exactly did he say that caused such a backlash?
Well, during his speech, he made quite a few comments that were seen as attacks on his political opponents. He called them corrupt and un-American. And he used some pretty inflammatory language that some people felt was dangerous and irresponsible.
Yeah, that kind of rhetoric has kind of been his signature style throughout his political career. But how did he defend himself when people criticized him?
Well, Trump said that his words were taken out of context and twisted around. He claimed that he was just being tough and telling it like it is, and that his critics were trying to silence him. It's a pretty common tactic for deflecting criticism.
It's a tricky situation, isn't it? On the one hand, you have freedom of speech and the right to express strong opinions, but on the other hand, those words could create division and even incite violence.
That's exactly why this incident was so controversial. It brings up these really important questions about what's acceptable in political discussions and how much responsibility leaders have to use their platforms in a way that doesn't cause harm.
It's a reminder that words can have a lot of power and real-world consequences, especially in a political climate that's already so divided.
And with only a week left before the election, when tensions are already high, an incident like this could influence undecided voters or make the existing divisions even worse.
Speaking of undecided voters, let's talk about that Joe Rogan interview that almost happened. That seemed to come out of nowhere. What do you think was going on there? Was it a calculated move by the Harris campaign?
Well, it's hard to say for sure without knowing what was going on behind the scenes. But we can speculate that maybe they were trying to reach a wider audience like younger voters and people who maybe don't trust traditional news sources.
Yeah, Rogan's podcast has a huge following, and it includes people from all walks of life.
Yeah,
So it would make sense for the Harris campaign to see it as a good way to connect with potential voters.
exactly. It shows they understand that the media landscape is changing and they need to change their strategies to reach voters wherever they are. It also shows how much influence podcasts and other non-traditional media platforms are having in shaping public discussion.
Yeah, it's a reminder that candidates can't just rely on TV appearances and newspaper interviews to get their message out anymore.
Right. The way we get information has completely changed, and campaigns need to adapt to keep up.
It's amazing to see how all these different elements, the places they go, the demographics, the messaging, and even the media platforms all come together to create this complicated web of campaign strategy.
And it's a web that keeps changing right up until the last weight is cast. Every decision, every speech, every interaction with the media is carefully planned for maximum impact.
And in an election this close, those calculations could very well decide who wins. But it's important to remember that behind all the strategy and the political maneuvering, there are real people making decisions about their country's future.
That's a really important point. Elections are about so much more than just winning and losing. They're about choosing the direction of the country, deciding what values are important, and creating the kind of society we want to live in.
And as we head into this final week, those choices have never felt more important. Every single vote matters. And it's up to each person to decide what kind of future they want to create. It's interesting to think about where both candidates will be on election night. We know Harris is going to be at Howard University with all the students and faculty. It's a place that represents her past and maybe even the future she's hoping to build.
Yeah, that's a really sharp observation. Choosing where to be on election night can be super symbolic. It usually says something about the candidate's values, their target audience, and the story they want to tell.
Exactly. And while we don't know yet where Trump will be, I'm sure he's put just as much thought into his choice, and it'll tell us something too. But no matter where they are, one thing's for sure, the energy and excitement on election night is going to be through the roof.
Absolutely. It's like the grand finale after months of campaigning, all those rallies and speeches and debates. It's the moment of truth when the American people finally decide who's going to lead them for the next 4 years.
It really reminds you that democracy, even with all its flaws, is a powerful and amazing thing. But let's switch gears for a minute and talk about something that really caught my attention this week, that whole Joe Rogan interview thing with Harris. It's not every day you see a presidential candidate going on a platform like that.
It just shows how much the media landscape is changing and how influential podcasts and other non-traditional media are becoming. These platforms offer a different kind of access, and they reach a really diverse audience, a lot of whom don't trust mainstream media.
And Rogan especially has a massive following that crosses all the usual political lines. It would have been fascinating to see how Harris handled that kind of interview, given Rogan's reputation for asking tough questions and pushing back against conventional thinking.
Yeah, it's definitely a missed opportunity. We could have learned a lot about Harris's policies and her personality, and it might have even swayed some undecided voters or brought in people who don't usually pay attention to politics.
It reminds us that these days, candidates have to be flexible and willing to talk to people on all sorts of different platforms. But hey, we still have a whole week to go and anything can happen. What are you going to be watching closely as we get closer to Election Day?
Well, I'll be checking the polls, obviously, but I'm also interested in things like voter turnout, early voting numbers, and how enthusiastic each side seems to be. Those are often better clues about what's really happening out there.
What about those last-minute scandals or surprises? Do you think they could really change things at this point?
It's tough to say.
Yeah.
Most voters have probably already made up their minds. But, a big mistake or a shocking news story could definitely influence some undecided voters or maybe even fire up one side's base more than the other.
So the game's not over yet, and the tension is definitely rising as we get closer to Election Day.
For sure. The stakes are incredibly high, and whoever wins this election will have a huge impact on the future of the country. It's a time of a lot of uncertainty, but also a time of a lot of possibility.
Well, there you have it, folks. A deep dive into the final week of the 2024 presidential election. We've broken down the candidates' closing arguments, their campaign strategies, and the key themes that are shaping this race.
And as we head towards Election Day, we'll leave you with this one last thought. Think about the places they chose for their closing arguments. The Ellipse in Washington, D.C., a place that's now forever linked to January 6th, and Allentown, Pennsylvania, a city that's dealing with a changing economy and a shifting population. How do these locations reflect the bigger ideas behind each campaign? What do they tell us about what each candidate wants for the future and the voters they're trying to connect with?
Those are some really interesting questions to think about as we head into this final week. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. We'll be back next week with a special post-election analysis. Until then, stay informed, stay involved, and most importantly, make your voice heard.